First item of business this afternoon is a statement by Nicola Sturgeon on Scotland and the EU. The Deputy First Minister will take questions at the end of her statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Nicola Sturgeon. Deputy First Minister, you've got 10 minutes.
Sir, I am pleased to have the opportunity to make a statement on an independent Scotland's continuing membership of the European Union and to respond to recent statements by the President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso. Firstly, let me be clear that the Scottish Government believes that Scotland should continue to be a member of the EU, a view that does not appear to be shared by a UK Government that is displaying ever-increasing signs of Euroscepticism. Indeed, in my view, it is the overtly hostile stance of the UK Government, or at least significant parts of it, that presents the real risk to Scotland's continuing membership of the European Union. This Government believes that Scotland does benefit from EU membership and that the EU benefits enormously from having Scotland as a member. It is also our view that Scotland's interests would be better represented in the EU by an independent Scottish Government with a seat at the top table, able to speak up for our national interests without having to seek the prior permission of UK ministers, and a government able to work closely and constructively with partners across these islands and across the EU to advance our shared interests. Presiding Officer, that is our ambition for Scotland's future in Europe. It is positive and constructive, with Scotland's and Europe's best interests at its heart, and it stands in sharp contrast to the stance of the UK Government. Let me now turn to the recent statements of the President of the European Commission. As head of the Commission, Mr Barroso's opinion on this matter should be, and will be by this Government, treated seriously and with respect. That is indeed why I have written to him, seeking an early opportunity to discuss the particular process by which Scotland would become independent and the implications of that for our continued EU membership. However, in doing so, it is important that I also set out the following points. Firstly, the European Commission, however important, is not the final arbiter of these matters. Mr Barroso's statements do not constitute a ruling, as some have suggested, nor does the Commission even claim to be specifically addressing the particular situation of Scotland. Indeed, the President of the Commission himself made clear in his letter to the House of Lords Committee that the European Commission has expressed its views in general. Second, there is absolutely no provision in the EU treaties for the disapplication of those treaties or the removal of EU citizenship from a country and its people when they exercise their democratic right to self-determination. And it would be quite extraordinary if anyone in this chamber, or indeed anyone else committed to the principle of democracy, was to suggest that there should be. Indeed, Mr Barroso said in response to a question on the 10th of November this year, there are no provisions in the treaties that refer to the secession from a member state. Therefore, what I would want to outline to the President, and indeed hear his views on, is the specific process by which Scotland would become independent and the way in which we would then seek to ensure that our intention to remain within the EU is achieved. Firstly, Presiding Officer, let me deal with the process of independence. As a result of the Edinburgh Agreement, that process is democratic, agreed and consensual, and the result will be respected and implemented by both the Scottish and the UK governments. Following a yes vote in 2014, a process of negotiation will take place with the UK Government on the transfer of powers to an independent Scottish Parliament. As I said last week, it would be the intention of the Scottish Government to invite representatives of the other parties and of Civic Scotland to contribute to that process. It is a process that we would intend to have completed in time for the next Scottish election in 2016. However, in the period between autumn 2014 and May 2016, Scotland would still be in the UK and therefore, by definition, still within the EU. In parallel to negotiations with the UK Government, it would be our intention to negotiate the terms of an independent Scotland's continuing membership of the EU. And here I should point out that the need for negotiations with the EU was made clear by the Government in choosing Scotland's future in 2007, in Your Scotland, Your Voice in 2009, and Your Scotland, Your referendum in 2012. And it is worth remembering that these are matters that are likely to be about political negotiation more than they will be about legal process. Let me also pause here to reflect on the position of the UK in such negotiations. It would be interesting to hear those who argue that an independent Scotland would have to reapply for EU membership explain in some detail why that same argument wouldn't also be true for the rest of the UK, given that the democratic process we are engaged in would lead to the dissolution of the UK in its current political form. However, since I don't believe we would be in a formal reapplication situation, I will not dwell on that point. However, what will undoubtedly be the case is that negotiation on terms of continuing membership will be highly relevant to the rest of the UK, which will require to determine, for example, its own number of seats in the European Parliament and its revised financial contribution. So I believe that Scotland and the rest of the UK would have a shared interest in concluding such negotiations smoothly and quickly. And I believe that such a sensible process of negotiation will result in Scotland's continuing membership of the EU on terms that are reasonable. And by that, I mean, for example, that just like Sweden, we would not join the euro until and unless it was in Scotland's interest to do so, and we had satisfied the conditions for doing so. And just like Ireland, we would not enter Schengen, but would instead look to cooperate with Ireland and the rest of the UK in the common travel area. Both of these positions are practical and justifiable and would, I am sure, be supported by all parties here in Scotland. And given their approach in other circumstances, the evidence suggests they would be understood by our European partners too. I will cite two reasons for my view, and in so doing, I am very deliberately relying not simply on arguments of law or process, but on arguments of common sense, reality and mutual self-interest. Firstly, the EU is an organisation that welcomes new members. It wants others to join. It most certainly would not want to see existing parts of its territory leave. Let me quote again the words of Mr Barroso. I see no country leaving. I see many countries wanting to join. The EU is an inherently flexible organisation. It adapts, as indeed it should, to the changing circumstances of its member states. To demonstrate that, we just have to look at how quickly and smoothly the former East Germany was integrated into the EU following reunification. Indeed, it's instructive to read the press release issued by the Commission about East Germany in 1990. It said the community institutions have all done their utmost to bring about the integration of what was the German Democratic Republic as smoothly as possible and within the timescale allowed by the unification process. There was no direct precedent for what happened with East Germany, just as there is no precedent for what might happen in Scotland. But the EU found a solution that is consistent with the principle of sincere cooperation that lies at the heart of the treaties. They adapted, and they did it on the basis of common sense and accommodation of internal decisions taken by one of its member states. Presiding Officer, my second reason for believing that Scotland would continue in membership of the EU is that it is overwhelmingly in the EU's interest for us to do so. And by that I don't just mean that to go through the complicated process of putting Scotland outside the EU just for us to be readmitted later would be, as Graham Avery, an Honorary Director General of the Commission, said, not feasible. I mean that Scotland's vast assets, fishing, oil and gas, renewables, our value as an export market to other member states, our education system enjoyed by thousands of EU students every year, and our status as home to tens of thousands of EU citizens mean that the economic, social and political interests of the EU would be best served by Scotland remaining in continuous membership. And let's just look at that in more detail. We have around 90% of the EU's oil and gas reserves. We accounted for around two-thirds of EU crude oil and a fifth of EU natural gas production in 2009. An independent Scotland would be the largest producer of oil, the second largest producer of gas in the entire European Union. In 2010-11, there were more than 16,000 EU students enrolled at our higher education institutions, 150,000 EU citizens living here by virtue of the freedom of movement that comes with us being part of the EU. In other words, Presiding Officer, we are an integral member of the EU, and it is simply not credible to argue that the other nations of the European Union would not want to retain access to the vast array of resources and opportunities that Scotland brings to the EU table. Indeed, Presiding Officer, if the opposition parties have Scotland's best interests at heart, then notwithstanding their opposition to independence, they will accept that in the event of a yes vote, the process I have outlined today would be in the best interests of Scotland, the UK and the EU. Presiding Officer, as I said earlier, I have sought the opportunity to discuss the matter with Mr Barroso in the near future, and I will be happy, very happy, to update Parliament again following that discussion.
The Deputy First Minister will now take questions on issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. It would be helpful, therefore, if members wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak button now, and I call Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Deputy First Minister for advance sight of her statement this afternoon. In December 2007, in answer to a question from my colleague Irene Oldfather, the Deputy First Minister, speaking at the European Committee of the Parliament, stated, and I quote, "It is a clear view of the Scottish National Party and the Government that Scotland would automatically be a member of the European Union upon independence," and I close quotes. Ms Oldfather went on to ask, "You would not require to negotiate?" To which Ms Sturgeon answered, "No." On the 13th of September 2012, during First Minister's questions, the First Minister said there must be negotiations. By the 10th of December 2012, the Yes campaign was issuing press releases stating that it was common sense that an independent Scotland would remain in the EU. And now today, in her statement, the Deputy First Minister simply talks about a vague intention to remain within the EU. Presiding Officer, first it was automatic, then we needed negotiation, then it was common sense, and now it's an intention. But of course, all of this and much of Ms Sturgeon's statement today is mere assertion.
Question, Ms Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So I'd like to ask Ms Sturgeon that during the nearly 6 years her government has been in power, which of the 27 member countries of the EU has she discussed the issue of Scotland's remaining in the European Union with, given that all of them would have a say on that particular matter? And what discussions to date has her government conducted with any official of the European Union concerning the matters that she now feels it so urgent to bring to the attention of President Barroso?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I make it absolutely clear to Patricia Ferguson, in case she didn't quite get the gist of this from my statement, there is no doubt about this government's commitment to remaining part of the European Union. If only the same could be said of some of the other parties represented in this chamber. Can I also refer her to, and I again mentioned this in my statement, can I refer her to Choosing Scotland's Future, a government publication in 2007, which made clear the point I have made clear again today about the requirement for negotiation. The difference of opinion, if I may say so, to Patricia Ferguson, is that I don't accept that Scotland would be in the position of having to reapply and that those negotiations would be about reapplication. But I do agree that we would be negotiating the terms of our continuing membership. But the key point that Patricia Ferguson and others really must grasp is that regardless of all of that, negotiations would take place within the European Union. That's the key point, and one that I would hope, in Scotland's interest, if for no other reason, Patricia Ferguson would accept. And in terms of her point about engagement, as the First Minister made clear at First Minister's questions today, this government wants to engage with a whole range of organisations and interests about our plans for the transition to independence and what we will do with the powers of independence. We will engage with the European Commission. I have already said that I have sought early discussions with President Barroso. Yes, we will engage with other member states, but I think the question Patricia Ferguson and others have to answer, or at least the point she has to make clear, is Patricia Ferguson really arguing, really saying that Scotland would be kicked out of the European Union? Because if she is saying that, she should say so explicitly, because it is an incredible proposition and it would undoubtedly and rightly attract the derision that it deserves.
Annabel Goldie.
Presiding Officer, can I thank the Deputy First Minister for prior sight of her statement. It's a triumph of optimism and evasiveness over hard-headed fact and reality, because it actually poses far more questions than it answers. Now, she says the process of negotiating Scotland's place in Europe will take just 18 months. How is that possible when the fastest ever process, Finland, took nearly 3 years? Does she even know? Does she even know if she will be granted a meeting with President Barroso? Does she even know when that meeting is likely to be? And what questions will she ask him? Or is she just going to tell him how it will be? I'm afraid that's a clear implication from this risible statement, because she actually says she is going to outline the process to President Barroso. Poor man. So she knows exactly what the process is. Well, why doesn't she share that with the rest of us? And most laughably of all, we're expected to believe that an independent Scotland will be in the same position as a bankrupt failed state like East Germany. That really will take... That really... In the statement, Presiding Officer...
Order.
In the statement...
Order. Order.
That really will take some explaining to the people of Scotland.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I say, firstly, optimism is not something I usually associate with the Scottish Conservatives. Secondly, I have to say it is incredibly amusing to hear such deference to the President of the European Commission emanating from the Tory benches. It was, as the First Minister said earlier on, only yesterday that David Cameron was standing up in the House of Commons and stating quite clearly and unequivocally, I do not agree with President Barroso. The statement I have made is based on common sense and realism, and I think most people, other than those gripped by the fevered imagination that grips the Better Together Tory-Labour-Liberal alliance, would recognise the realism at the heart of what I said. And I have to say, Annabel Goldie, I think, rather demeans herself and her party with the comments she's just made about East Germany. I was not comparing Scotland to East Germany. I was using the example. Of a process that demonstrates the adaptability, the flexibility and the realism of the European Union. Annabel Goldie might want to reflect on the fact that reunification of Germany, I think, was agreed in September, and in October of the same year, East Germany became part of the European Union. So perhaps when she is making comments about timescales, she might want to reflect on actual situations and actual precedents. I go back to my central point. Is Annabel Goldie or anybody else in this chamber seriously saying that Scotland would find itself ejected from the European Union? Oil-rich, renewable energy-rich, fishing-rich Scotland. If they are arguing that, then they should stand up and argue it explicitly, and they'll be laughed out of the chamber and laughed at right across this country, as they will deserve to be.
We are now moving to back-bench questions. Many people want to ask a question. Can I ask those who are going to ask a question to make the questions brief? And I'd appreciate brief answers as well. Can I say one more thing? And that is that the opposition parties asked for this statement today. It is important that we question the Deputy First Minister in the way that she needs to be questioned, and it's important that the Deputy First Minister answers these questions too. Therefore, I really would appreciate it very much if I didn't have to call order every 10 or 15 seconds. Let us get through this and let us conduct ourselves the way that we as a Parliament should. And I will Ewan, followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister if she takes the view, as I certainly do, that the claim that citizens of an independent Scotland would somehow be stripped of their rights as EU citizens simply for exercising their democratic right of self-determination is frankly nothing more than scaremongering.
Yes, but do you have a question, Ms Ewing?
And would she agree that it is, moreover, totally in contravention of common sense?
Deputy First Minister.
Yes, I do. And I think it is worth just focusing on the implications of what the other parties argue, because if they are correct and Scotland would be kicked out of the European Union, not only would Scottish citizens be stripped of our EU citizenship, but the citizens of other European countries would be stripped of their rights vis-à-vis Scotland. So the fishermen of other countries, Spain or France, for example, would no longer have the rights that they enjoy. Businesses of other European countries would no longer have these rights. The citizens that currently live in Scotland would no longer enjoy these rights. The students. That underlines how preposterous a position that the opposition are putting forward and why, frankly, they don't deserve to be taken seriously as a result.
Kate McIntosh, followed by Willie Rennie.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased that the Deputy First Minister has finally admitted that the terms of Scotland's EU membership are now a matter of negotiation. She then goes on in her statement to say that joining the euro would not be up for negotiation, joining the Schengen Agreement would not be up for negotiation. Can I ask specifically, would Britain's euro rebate be a matter of negotiation, currently worth £90 to every Scot?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I firstly say to Ken McIntosh, he might, since he's always very keen to pull up members on these benches for alleged and usually inaccurately alleged inaccuracies, can I suggest that he goes and checks some documents and then he might realise that his comment about me finally conceding negotiations is completely inaccurate. 2007, 2009, 2012 in terms of previous documents. Now, in terms of the euro, I would also suggest that he looks closely and in detail at the situation in Sweden. And as we heard earlier on, the article in The Scotsman this morning makes clear that no country can be forced to join the euro. In terms of the rebate, I would be confident of an independent Scottish Government negotiating a good deal for Scotland, which is something UK governments have consistently failed to do. But I think, in all seriousness, I think this is an issue in where Scotland and the UK would have a shared interest, because, as I said in my statement, independence for Scotland means a renegotiation of many of these matters for the UK as well. So we would work together to get the best deal, and I'm confident that an independent Scottish Government arguing for Scotland's interests in a way that UK governments fail to do would get a much better deal than we've been used to in the past.
Willie Rennie, followed by Christina McKelvey.
I thank the Deputy First Minister for an advanced sight of the statement. The statement at least answers the question I asked the First Minister earlier on today. Does he expect all the 27 member states to simply sign up to whatever the Scottish Government demands? And the answer seems to be yes, they do. Every single thing. Seems to be that she's got some starry-eyed belief that an independent Scotland would never lose out in any negotiation ever for the rest of time. But back in reality, can she answer Patricia Ferguson's question? When does she plan to meet the 27 members of the European Union to establish whether they agree with her claims?
Deputy First Minister.
I look forward to engaging with other member states. I look forward to engaging with the European Commission. I look forward to engaging, if they will engage with us, with the UK Government on the arguments for Scotland being an independent country, because I think those arguments are not just compelling, I believe they are unanswerable. And the question Willie Rennie has to answer is why he believes that other member states, and let's remember the context in which we would be operating in, just after the people of Scotland had democratically voted in a democratic referendum to become an independent country. Now, I don't know, maybe in Willie Rennie's world, people wouldn't respect that democratic decision of the Scottish people, but I believe other countries across the European Union would. But I don't just believe it for that reason. I believe it because it is in the overwhelming interest of the rest of Europe to keep Scotland within the European Union. And sooner or later, the opposition parties, notwithstanding their opposition to independence, are going to have to stop arguing as if they are against the interests of Scotland in this debate, because that is how they are coming across.
Christina McKelvey, followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When the Deputy First Minister meets Mr Barroso, will she raise concerns with the European Commission regarding the UK withdrawal from the EU? And does she agree that the biggest threat to Scotland's EU membership comes from the Westminster Government and not Scottish independence?
Deputy First Minister.
Yes, I do. And it's a serious point, because if it wasn't so serious, it would be utterly laughable to have to listen to Tory and those that prop them up in the Liberals coming here to wring their hands about the continuing EU membership of an independent Scotland, when all the time at Westminster large sections of these parties are conspiring to get the UK and by extension Scotland out of the European Union. So I would suggest to the Tories in particular that they put their own house in order before they start giving lessons to anybody else.
James Kelly, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can the Deputy First Minister state if the Government has received any specific legal advice on the matter of EU membership? And can the Deputy First Minister also explain how the Scottish people can trust a government that spent 5 years claiming its position in EU membership, was backed by legal advice, wasted public money to prevent the publication of this advice, and then destroyed its own credibility by denying that that legal advice ever existed?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, as the member knows, I said in my statement on the 23rd of October that the Government had commissioned specific legal advice on the issue of Scotland's membership of the European Union. That has not yet been received. But on the issue of trust, I don't think any party that in the election last year got the electoral hiding that Labour got really has any place to come to this chamber and talk about trust. The people of Scotland demonstrated which party they trusted in the election. And since then, of course, we've had Joanne Lamont U-turning on all the universal benefits that she once used to promise. And I think at the next electoral opportunity, the people of Scotland will take the same decision all over again.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What effect does the Deputy First Minister anticipate the loss of Scotland as an EU member state would have upon the European Union?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, as I said in my statement, and you know, the other members of the opposition parties can laugh all they like, but the fact of the matter is they behave as if Scotland would be going to the European Union empty-handed. Scotland brings vast resources and vast opportunities to that European table. I already outlined in statistics the wealth of our oil and gas resources. Our fishing resources are equally enormous. The opportunities that students get coming to study here in our world-renowned education system. My own constituency has thousands of people living in it from across the European Union. Is anybody seriously suggesting that overnight the rights and responsibilities of all of these people would be taken away? It is not a credible proposition. So let's have a robust debate about independence over these next couple of years. But let the opposition stop insulting the intelligence of the Scottish people, because that's what they're doing.
Margaret MacDonald, to be followed by Stuart Maxwell.
Is it me?
Yes, Miss MacDonald, you.
There was so much noise, Presiding Officer.
Sorry about that.
Well, the Deputy First Minister say why she insists on pursuing this line of argument, which conflates the policy on Europe of the party in government with the principle. There's a great confusion outside the walls of this place as to how we straighten these out. And will she explain why she's not going to see the governments of EFTA? I think it would be time better spent.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I know Margot MacDonald's position on this. I think she puts forward a perfectly respectable position. My view is that Scotland is better served within the European Union, and I think the European Union is better served to have Scotland within it. Now, in response to the first part of her question, with the greatest of respect, I am making this statement as a Scottish Government Minister, so I think it is reasonable for me to articulate Scottish Government policy. But I, at every opportunity when I'm discussing the matter of Scottish independence, make clear the distinction between the policy of this Government and the restoration of powers to this Parliament that would allow other parties to stand on other platforms and, if elected, implement policies that may not be the same as the policies of this Government. I think that is a very clear distinction. Margot MacDonald is right to point it out, and I will continue to do so. But as long as I'm speaking for the Scottish Government in this Parliament, I think it's reasonable for me to articulate the policies of this Government.
Stuart Maxwell, followed by Helen Eadie.
Thank you, President Officer. I note the comments made by Willie Rennie at FMQs that the First Minister must set out what an independent Scotland would stand to lose from having a seat at the top table in the European Union. Can the Deputy First Minister set out what the benefits would be of a direct Scottish representation within the EU?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I think I'm not just being uber loyal and crawling here, but I don't think I could better the First Minister's answer to Willie Rennie when he asked that particular question earlier on.
Order.
Maybe I could. Maybe on another occasion I will try. I think on the serious point that Stuart Maxwell raises, we stand to gain a great deal, I believe, not just from continuing to be in the European Union, but being in the European Union with an independent seat at the top tables of the European Union. I'm sure Richard Lochhead, for example, would articulate very clearly the benefits of him being a minister of an independent government when it comes to crucial talks on fishing. And I believe many people across Scotland would want to see a rigorous, assertive representation in Europe, but would prefer Scotland not to be tainted with the increasing Euroscepticism that we see coming from the Conservatives south of the border. So speaking with our own voice, asserting our own interest, but working as constructive partners with our friends across the European Union, I believe is the right future for Scotland, and I believe it's that future for Scotland that will win the day in 2014.
I still have many members who want to ask a question and intend to continue this for just a wee while longer. I doubt I'm going to get to everybody, but I intend to try to take time out of the debates further on the programme. Helen Eadie, followed by Patrick Harvie.
I'm grateful to you, Presiding Officer, and no member had better ever accuse me of ever wanting to withdraw from the EU. I have campaigned all my adult life.
Yes, but can we get a question, Ms Eadie?
I have repeatedly raised the issue in the Scottish Parliament with the Deputy First Minister and indeed the First Minister about the issues of the Scottish Parliament having an inquiry and about the Scottish Government facilitating such an inquiry. And so why is it, if the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister believe so much on democracy and on trust, why is it that they're continually blocking their black benchers of this Scottish Parliament from allowing for an inquiry into membership of the EU and all that it has an impact on the people of Scotland? Because the issues raise very fundamental issues that are key, and the people of Scotland must know these answers. And
I think we get your point, Ms Eadie. I think we've got your point, Mrs Eadie. And can I also say it is not within the responsibilities of the Deputy First Minister to decide what committees of this Parliament do or they do not do. Patrick Harvie, followed by Rod Campbell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Deputy First Minister say with confidence that if negotiations are successfully concluded, the implementation, such as Scotland's representation on the Commission and the Parliament, would not trigger domestic ratification procedures in other EU countries relating to treaty changes?
Deputy First Minister.
I am confident that the process of Scotland's continuing membership of the European Union, with Scotland and other member states acting in good faith based on our shared interest, would be able to be implemented smoothly. I've already cited one precedent, not a direct precedent, but one former example where that process takes place. So yes, I am confident of that, and I'd be happy to discuss it further with Patrick Harvie if he would find that helpful.
Rod Campbell, followed by Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the opposition party's previous rather obsessive concerns as to the ability of this party to hold a legally binding referendum, only for the Scottish and UK governments to resolve these issues by a process of negotiation, does the Deputy First Minister agree that an independent Scotland's continued membership of the EU will be ensured by a process of negotiation too?
Deputy First Minister.
Yes, I do believe that. I believe that very strongly, and I think Rod Campbell is absolutely right to point to those, including some people in this chamber who, at the start of this year, were saying that the UK and the Scottish Government could never sit down and negotiate an agreement that would lead to the referendum that he talks about. So I think we've demonstrated that that can be the case. And it takes me, I think, to a crucial point. And, we will have passionate, heated, noisy debates over the next couple of years, because it is perfectly legitimate for people to argue against independence, and it's legitimate for those who believe in independence to argue for it. But what we all have to recognise is that once the people of Scotland decide, and if the people of Scotland decide democratically to become an independent country, then the Scottish Government and the UK Government will work together to implement that. That's encapsulated in the Edinburgh Agreement. But even if it wasn't, it makes sense, because many of the things that will be in the interests of Scotland at that point will also be in the interests of the rest of the United Kingdom. And that common sense, mature attitude, I believe, will prevail, and we have the example of the Edinburgh Agreement that points to that.
Drew Smith, and then finally Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful. The Deputy First Minister has failed to convince me why she is right and President Barroso is wrong, so can I therefore ask her a simpler question? What is her understanding of the word automatic, and how does this differ from the term after negotiation?
Deputy First Minister.
If I had set the test for my statement today as being having to convince Drew Smith, I would have been setting myself up for some spectacular failure to do so. So if you forgive me, that was not the kind of test that I had set for it. I think it's very clear, and I want to make a serious point, because Mr Barroso is the President of the European Commission. That is a position that brings with it a great deal of authority, and he deserves to be treated with respect. But as I said in my statement, he is not the final arbiter of these matters. The difference of opinion between myself and President Barroso lies in whether the negotiations would be negotiations about a reapplication or negotiations about continuing membership. That's the difference of opinion. But, in any event, those negotiations would take place within the European Union, not least because in that period we would still be within the UK. And, that takes me again to that common sense point. Does anybody really believe that it is in the interests of the European Union to eject Scotland? And that's where the arguments of all of the opposition parties flounder. They can come up with all of these technical process arguments they like, but they founder on the common sense point, and they will always founder on that because they've got it wrong on that point.
Jim Eadie.
Does the Deputy First Minister agree with me that the prize for Scotland as an independent member state is the opportunity to be at the centre of decision-making within the institutions of the European Union, and that if Scotland votes yes, she can look forward to the day when she will occupy the presidency of the European Council, as other small nations have consistently and successfully done since the EU's inception?
Deputy First Minister.
Again, it's outrageous to hear the guffaws from the opposition benches there. Ireland, independent Ireland, will assume the presidency in January. Why shouldn't Scotland aspire to be in exactly the same position? But, I do look forward to the day when we are represented by ministers of an independent Scottish Government. And something? I'd rather be represented in Europe even by the independent minister of another party than by a Tory UK minister who more often than not will misrepresent the interests of Scotland. So roll on the day when we are an independent member of the European Union.